place that sort of lights up their dream. They track down the realtor or the owner himself, and they sign a lease, and the owner or the realtor says, so you're responsible for the tenant finish, and the entrepreneur sees flowers and paint and gets excited about that. And you're responsible for the utilities, and you need to go down to the city to get whatever permits you need. Okay, well that sounds great. So they go down to City Hall, and they eventually find their way to the building department. And then the fun often begins, because their dream is not officially allowed in the allowed uses in that zone. That happens a lot. It happens a lot because those zoning codes were written in a very sort of rigid, prescribed way. It says, here's what you can do in this zone. And in my experience in this state and others is that they're quite a bit out of date. And those businesses that are on the list may not be viable anymore, and the dream of the entrepreneur at the counter hadn't even been heard of or imagined when that code was written. And because updating those codes is sometimes expensive and sometimes very troubling, they've never been updated. Now, most cities find their way to sort of bend and twist a little bit to try to help you out, but it's tough sometimes. And not all cities have the time or the willingness to do that because they've been burned by the process, right? And so they bend and twist, and then a member of the committee of negativity protests, or a neighbor or a fearful competitor says, well, I kind of want to put the brakes on that, and it's pretty easy to do that if you want to make a mess of it. So we got to get the use. So the planner or at the desk may say, well, you can amend the zone, and we'll allow that use, and we're a business-friendly community. Just apply to amend the zone. Hire a consultant. Produce that new zoning code, help us, we'll work with you as you do that, and you'll be allowed. And so there's an expense. And oh, by the way, the building is for lease. It's been empty for over a year. You're gonna have to bring it up to date. And so we start looking at things like the safety code, so add some sprinklers to that. There may be some utility work that has to be done. Maybe the roof needs repaired. All kinds of things like that. And because I'm an entrepreneur, I don't do this every day, or maybe never before. I never thought to ask these questions when I was talking to the landlord. And you might need a building permit to do something. Well, there's an expense to that. And oh, by the way, when you're getting a building permit, we might need you to pave the alley, because you're going to have a truck back there. And because we as a city no longer invest in shared infrastructure, we say, well, business pays its own way, so you're going to pave the alley. And oh, by the way, we haven't invested very much in maintaining the street up front, so since you're driving traffic, you may have to do some street improvements too. Well, the entrepreneur's broke at that point, and they haven't made the dime one. And so the phone rings. The city counselors in the room now get to raise their hands. Your phone rings. Someone's complaining about the business unfriendly methods in your city. And that's not a call that you like to get. And so at various points you'll rally and thump the table about making streamlining regulations, lowering the cost to do business, and that's all fine. That's good, but that's not going to solve the problem for that entrepreneur on that day. And I think those are other tools that are often overlooked. So, in economic development, one of the principles is lowering cost of doing business, streamlining regulation. The other thing is trying to align expenses with revenues, and this is what cities fail to think about because they don't typically have to do this. So you've just front-loaded all the expenses onto that entrepreneur they'll be lucky to see revenue in 3 years and profits in 5 if they ever get that far. And so there are techniques, if you're willing to use them, where you can push back some of those expenses so that that entrepreneur can get into that building and not go broke in the process. And you know, I often get into conversations with folks involved in the building code. The sprinkler system is one of my favorites. Does it matter if the business fails in 3 years that it didn't get sprinkled until year 5? The building's empty again anyway. So what is it we're trying to achieve with all this? And I think what we're trying to achieve is how to grow business, how to grow entrepreneurs, how to grow our community, not necessarily how to checkbox a regulatory system that was easy to put together but doesn't make any sense really on the ground. Too often those codes are written because when the McDonald's comes to town, or the Starbucks, or someone like that who has both the expertise and the money, we can expect to front load those things, have them fix our alleys, have them fix our streets, and do all that sorts of thing. And it makes sense to have codes written for that kind of experience. It makes less sense if you're in a small rural place where there's not enough commercial activity to attract those kinds of businesses. You have to shift your focus to the kind of businesses that are likely to arrive and thrive in your community, which is almost always someone with a local heart connection to that community, to that place, who for whatever reason needs to be there to thrive or come back to thrive. And I've got a little bit more to talk about coming back to thrive later. So you have to rethink these things. And so, but that's not the tradition in planning and zoning. It's for these other kinds of uses. And now you're in towns that are stuck on a declining path because you're not attracting the businesses with money, and you're not helping the cash-strapped local entrepreneurs get their toe in and get started to do it. So one of the things to do is start revising that building code. Now, I was interested in when you were watching your 4 examples. I'm familiar with zoning codes all over state. Most of them are illegal. Yeah. In most cities. Yes. And in Oregon, we have a department of the state government, my department, which enforces and helps forces enforce and creates mechanisms for the committee of negativity to enforce those kinds of changes, right? So it's stacked against those entrepreneurs, and it doesn't have to be. Because that can change. It can change. Local governments have a lot of control and influence over the zoning. I have a little bit of it too here in Oregon, but mostly it's local governments. And we are not in the business of making those kinds of businesses difficult to do, but your code has to comply. And then depending on what your business is, there's other things. So there's the health code, there's the commercial kitchen stuff. You're going to be asked if you're making food. I was wondering about the empanadas. Where's the grease trap and all of that kind of stuff, because that's going to all come up, right? And it's going to be very difficult for that individual person who may not be the most empowered, connected person in the community to navigate all that. And so one of the things that small cities can do is to make that path less dangerous. Let's just say it for that. Less dangerous for that entrepreneur. So there's more of a chance that their business idea can grow and thrive as an idea and not be killed by a misplaced regulatory framework. I'm not saying that it's invalid. I'm going to be careful about that, but misplaced according to the goals of the community, which we're saying in small rural places is to help small rural businesses survive and thrive in place. So what can you do? Right, and so is Noel still here? So we're talking about people getting into buildings and working with property owners that are unfamiliar with different kinds of business models. And, they mostly tear off a piece of standard lease from a tablet of standard leases. Oh, there you are. And they don't know anything about this. So what you could do, and what we could all do, is sort of say, well, let's create a model lease that entrepreneurs and landlords that have owned that building for a long time can agree on. And we can conform to the law, and we can create opportunity so that business transaction makes sense in the reality that we're working with and trying to achieve. And that's a thing. So you've got lottery funds for economic development in Marion County. That's a thing that you could do. The COG represents many of the cities in the county and COGs elsewhere. That's a thing that you could work on, both those revised model codes, those kinds of lease and SDC kinds of agreements, tools as cities readjust themselves to this kind of reality that they can use. Now, I can't let myself off the hook because my department is also, should be in that business. And we've got an interesting section in our department where it's the Transportation Growth Management Division, which is very much focused on transportation, the street. We don't have an entrepreneurial growth management division in our, we don't do that, and I'm wondering who does. And so here's Denny from Business Oregon. He doesn't have that either. They're very much focused on industrial development, and that's what Chad's business is too. That's larger scale recruitments. This is not so much often about Main Street pop-up, somebody selling a flower pot on a table in what was the name of the store? The Village, yeah, that's right. That's not what Chad and Denny do. They're tasked with something else. And so someone, or many someones, have to take that on. And I don't think, so I see some city managers around the room, I don't think small cities can do this by themselves. It's out of scale for you, but collectively, with these partners, can do some of that stuff. Create those agreements, get those kinds of code changes in place. What it's interesting, and I say in my sort of description of this thing, getting to the right scale, enabling scale. So you saw the big box store with false fronts to make it look like Main Street. And you see the Village, which is a Main Street store, which is broken down and to create smaller spaces, both in the front as you look at it and inside as you experience it. So getting to scale in terms of facilities, I'll just use that word, but storefronts, so that it matches what the real business activity is in your community. And if they are not aligned, that means they're missing each other. And if they're missing each other, business is not happening in your place. And that's the goal. So creating those models, helping cities implement those, helping them get the word out, those are things that you can do to make this kind of activity happen. And so we've got the Main Street program in the back. They're very much in this kind of business. I forgot to mention to you when I was giving you the list of partners that should have resources and involvement. So Sherry, you're in on the usual suspects list as well. So now, since I get the microphone and I'm in the front of the room, I get to tell one of my pet stories and dreams. So Chad and Denny are working on industrial development for the state and for the Salem area. I've got a dream of something that I like to call live, work, industrial. And this is an idea that is designed to drive your fire marshal crazy. Because when I say I want to live above my welding shop, the conversation is pretty much over for the traditional kind of fire marshal and building inspector. But I look at idle industrial property that's left over from a previous use that is of no interest to modern industrial development. But it's zoned industrial, and industrial allows a heavier use that's less neighbor-friendly than the tea shop that's in a house, which is also illegal. And so imagine that welder who is making a specialty part because he came out of the aircraft industry somewhere, but likes to also do some arty stuff that he can sell to tourists on the weekend. And you know what? It's expensive in Oregon now. I can't really afford to have a house and a shop and all of that stuff. I would like to actually live and work. And mostly when they say live, work, we're talking about, an office or a retail and an apartment above or behind. But live, work, industrial, where you can have, we'll just call it a more blue collar thing. So my welder who has an apartment above or behind it is a model, I think, that many smaller communities can use to not only have an investor, but also to drive visitors, right? Because where do you like to visit when you travel? Well, I visit the coffee shop and sometimes the chocolate shop, but I like to go see people do stuff. And so we know in Lincoln City where they have the glass blowing things, they're doing stuff. That's an industrial use. They're blowing glass. There's a furnace there. I don't know if I want to live above that furnace, but I wouldn't mind living attached to that furnace if I was a glass artist and I needed to do something like that. Well, so the local approach to zoning can do much of that, and we can help do that. So in Oregon, they have a sort of a state control of the building code. So I used to live and work in Colorado, and local governments, home rule cities have more control over the building code than they do in Oregon. And so I think individual cities, so city managers, I'm not tasking you with this because it's beyond, I think, what you can do. But again, collectively, we can have the conversation with legislators and say, you know what, maybe the building code could be a little more entrepreneurial friendly in instances and locations where it seems to make sense. And I think that can get done. But that's a little bit heavier lift than we're talking about today. And then when you talk about community building, what do you kind of need? So most of this stuff has been mentioned. So on my list, it were pop-up businesses. I think Becky mentioned the broadband. We're connected to everywhere now. Well, not every community here has a great broadband connection. We keep talking about it. That problem needs to get solved. There are communities, Independence and Monmouth have taken a run at that pretty successfully. There are other communities around the state that have done it and around the nation that have done it in different models. And if you don't have that in your community, I would start with a conversation with the system in Independence and Monmouth, but look beyond that. There are people working on that. You need to get that into your community if you want my live, work, welder guy to be able to sell his widgets and his art across the world. Because UPS will come and pick it up. Right? And then I think I don't need to go about the difference about, and I think you brought this up. Don't try to be an urban place. Be good at being a rural place. That's your strength, right? That's the fabric that counts. So you did a good job in presenting that. So I'm not going to go into that one very much. But I am going to mention something that you left out. So if you've seen me speak before, I always ask this question. I'm going to ask it again. How many of you live or work in a community where the city council and the school board get together, let's say annually, and talk about their business?
So that's coming later.
Well, yeah, you're going to do that one later. Anybody live working? One person's hand is tentatively going into the air. A couple more. Okay, so since a couple of hands went up, the part B to the question is, and do they talk about housing? In Oregon, as in Colorado, young families and rooftops are what drives the funding models for schools and for cities. Young families are often the workforce that small communities need to attract and hold to survive. And yet the two things that have the most local control in most communities, the local school district and the city itself, almost never meet. And if they ever meet, they never talk about the thing that gives them the juice. It's the housing. Housing policy in most of your communities are, we're business friendly, and if the developer shows up at the desk and wants to build something, we're happy to take his building permit fee and let him go do what he wants. His job is to meet the market that exists that moment and build houses as fast as he can until the music stops, and hopes that his business survives that cycle. And that's fine. That's his business. But as community leaders, you're thinking about, how do I get this mix right so that young families can be attracted, find a place to live, have their kids in the elementary school and stay through high school, and then when they leave the nest, their parents can sort of age in place in the community and keep that cycling of real estate assets designed and maintained and thrive for the thriving of the community. It's a key policy thing that most communities miss. And they miss it because they take it for granted. It's right in front of them every day. They don't think about it. They don't think that needs to be actively managed. And from my point of view, that's the only thing that a lot of local towns get to do and do effectively, and yet they ignore that. They spend their time on other stuff. They have global aspirations and make messages, but they don't really do the nuts and bolts of what they need to do to keep their communities in business for the long haul. So that's where I go. And so where to go next? So I don't use PowerPoints, as you've probably noticed. I do use the audience. And so I've got, folks here that know me well. What am I? Yeah, so I'm just going to invite you to ask questions as I go along. I'm going to switch my topic a little bit, so I'm inviting you, if there's anything you want to ask or talk about, let me know. Well, the next thing is, where do you find people to do this lifting, this local leadership and political stuff? Well, you got to grow them, right? And in many small towns like the one I came from, 1,200 in a cornfield in Minnesota, just took that for granted. The same 5 people were doing the same things all the time, and nobody else was really included in the conversation, until there's a crisis. Well, then, everybody's involved and they're mad about something. You have to grow them, and where do you find them? So a lot of you have been to conversations in your communities. Oh no, we need to do something about economic development. We're going to start a new committee to talk about economic development. I think that's a bad idea. It's really hard to stand up a new organization and get them to do stuff. Much better, says Tom, to go out to existing community organizations that have been standing. Where's my Lions guy? Go out to the Lions Club. Go out to the churches, go out to anybody that's regularly meeting for whatever reason, and talk to them about economic development, how cities work, what they can do. You asked what the Lions can do. I think that's a tremendous question. Who do you support? Are you going to support individuals that are maybe entrepreneurs, or are you going to support property owners who are maybe kind of wondering, does this make any sense? Or are you going to help the conversation in the community get past the committee of negativity and all of that kind of stuff and be the person or the group that says, you know what, we have to be open to new ideas in this community if we're going to thrive. And I think the service clubs and the churches are very well suited to do that. Now, I know the mayors are often expected to do all that work. It's really hard to do that as an individual when you're on the limelight and you have the constraints of the political office. They will go like that if you stand up and do some of that community truthing and leveling for them. And you can do that. You guys are fabric of the community. Other groups are. You've got to help your community get through some of those. Can I just call it a stupid conversation? Is that fair? You have to help them get beyond that, because there are going to be a handful of motivated people who will stand up and be stupid every week. So you got to sort of say, well, thanks, but the conversation's moving on because we as a community, we're pulling together to thrive. And so there is an answer for you. You can help with money, you can help with organization, you can do stuff yourself, but you can also help the community conversation evolve. Go ahead, sir, you're about to ask.
One thing I do personally with my Lions Club is there's a homeless drop-in center in a church that wants to get a place of their own.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to be working with the grant writer there to write a grant from Lions Club International.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So they call them service clubs for a reason. You're providing a service. And the other thing you see in a lot of towns is that the city council and the community leaders are the oldest and the grayest looking people in the room, or in the town even. And so the other thing you have to do is seek out and grow young leaders. And you work with them in the schools, and you find them in the churches and the younger members of the service clubs. And I think every organization should send that young spark plug to a group of other young spark plugs and give them support to do not what you want them to do, what they want to do.
That was the key right there. That's the key.
What they want to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not what you want them to do.
Right, right. And so the Main Street is important, do that. But when you're doing Main Street, don't do the flower baskets. Flower baskets are nice. But what you want to do is work on retaining the grocery store, because that is essential to a lot of your small towns. And grocery stores are tough business, right? Tough business to keep alive. Margins are thin, expenses are high, there's shrinkage and spoilage, all that kind of stuff. Help that. And that may become, in small towns, one of those civic functions, those public-private partnerships that you need to take an active role in order to help it to continue to survive. The same thing applies in a different way, though, to the post office and to the community newspaper. Those are disappearing in a lot of small towns. And if you still got them, you might have to help keep them alive, because that is part of the stitching together of the community fabric. And if they've already gone, then you have to think about what's the modern equivalent? You know, is it a Facebook page? Is it some kind of newsletter? How do you get people connected together in a way that's not hateful and all that other stuff that we see on the internet today? There's got to be a way to do that so that people know, you know, what their neighbors are doing, what the businesses in town are doing and hoping that they'll do for them. All that kind of public information that's essential to keeping these small towns alive as small towns, not just bedroom communities where everybody leaves in the day. You've got to keep those basic civic functions together with basic civic investment. Curb appeal matters. I've been in towns where they say, we respect your property rights and you can have it be as ugly as you want it to be. You can put all the junk on the curb that you want to be. And when I drive into your town, I go like, I'm in one of those towns right now, because we're respecting those folks so much that they've got junk and cars. Curb appeal matters. And so if you're going to have one of your towns that's going to survive, it's got to look good to the folks coming through. Now that takes some collective action and maybe some regulation, but that's a later step. And so again, the Lions and the service club and the churches can have that conversation. It's really hard for the elected leaders to do that. We would like it to be easier to have them do it successfully. But it's going to take other kinds of organizations to have that happen. And so what I've talked a lot about is, and Sherry's heard me say this, is getting new uses into old buildings. And unfortunately, a lot of the established city procedures, if not the intent, but the procedures are skewed against that. And a couple more things I want to talk about is never skip a class reunion. So if you are among those people in your town that wanted to see it survive and thrive, the people that are going to do that are the same people that come to the class reunions. And you would be remiss, perhaps fatally so, if you skip having a conversation with those people when they're in town and are meeting together. The younger ones, especially when they start having kids, are highly motivated to come back and live near grandma and free babysitting and the kind of family support if they could only find a way to make a living. And then they start looking at empty buildings on Main Street and think about the skills they've learned when they graduated and left and now could bring home in order to get that fabric, because if you grew up in a small town, it's in your heart forever. So do that, engage them, but money is often an issue. And so you look to the people that are coming to their 40th and 50th class reunions as your angel investor pool. It's the only one you're going to find in most small towns, and they're highly motivated. You know, they like the football team, they think of themselves as a team. That's where your angel investors are from. Your job is to get those folks talking about being angel investors for their community together with those young returnees that are thinking about, how could I get something going here? That's essential. And then the last thing I just like to do, you know, for me, I would rather have leadership and no money than money and no leadership. That's just me. And so, you know, what does leadership do? And so I think a couple of things that I want to mention is I think leadership has to sort of ground truth everything, and that's a familiar role for the elected leaders. But the other thing they have to do is they have to identify, form, and nurture the kinds of partnerships that the new reality demands, whether that's the town 5 miles down the road that's your traditional football rival that you never would talk to, would never be seen dead in that town. You've got to have a conversation with them because you're not competing with them, you're competing with the rest of the world. They're actually your partner. You know, I look at the Santiam Canyon, many of you are from there. That's a unit that could be spectacular in a global sense of people coming to visit there. You could make that work, but the tradition there is that they're tiny villages that are traditionally kind of mad at each other and don't cooperate very well. So I think those things can be fixed. So identifying and making those partnerships and nurturing those partnerships is crucial. I'm going to wrap because my time is up, and I will take questions for a couple of minutes, and thank you for your time and attention.
While I walk over, I'm going to take the first question because I have the mic.
Yep.
It's a bit of a plug for the COG.
Good.
We are working with, so I'm hearing about downtown development, but also the livability in all age groups. And so we're working with 3 communities right now who, for various reasons, so all in the Willamette Valley, but it's interesting to see the needs of the communities. One of our communities said we're interested in accessory dwelling units because we have a workforce that is not ready for marriage. So there's a need there, right? And it's workforce based. We have another community, different region, where they have private investors that want to do a model tiny home village. So there's an opportunity there, different from the other community. And then we have a third community that's saying, we have tiny lots, we need tiny homes. So we're working with these communities, different needs, different end goal that they're looking for, but we're hoping to bring in the building code inspectors and kind of work through that first step. So I think there's opportunities in downtown development with that as well. So no questions.
No, that's perfect. That's great. Thank you.
Walt Perry, City of Jefferson. My question is about something you really didn't touch on.
Okay.
A lot of these small cities are small areas, small cities. And throughout history, one horse town, one gas station town, a little store. A lot of these buildings have aged, a lot of these sites are gone. But there hasn't been any mention about environmental remediation. Costly item, and small cities can't do it.
Right.
Are there any probable or possible ways to bring this about?
So a couple of things I would say. So there are sites that have those problems, and the brownfield program that the state has is probably the best tool for cleaning up the land and those sites. But a lot of those buildings, which is I think what your real question is, they're laced with asbestos, yeah, and there's PCBs and all that other kinds of stuff. And again, your point is completely valid about small town Jefferson, too small to do that on their own. But again, 22 towns in Marion County, 20. Collectively, I think those things can be tackled. And what you want to do is get it to the point where it's just a question of money, right? And not of mystery or regulation, but just how do you make the money work? And that's when I think you start bringing in the tools of economic development to say, how do we align costs and revenues in a way that makes sense? I think small towns especially are in the business of running a portfolio of community assets, and that they have to think about themselves as portfolio managers, and that those assets are meant to show a return. There's some costs, some investments, but you think about it that way. Getting at scale is hard for small towns, and that's why I think you have to have partnerships. And there are larger organizations, mine, again, Business Oregon, which runs the Brownfield program, and others that can help some of that seed capital, but at the end, nothing will happen unless it's a paying proposition.
Not so much a question, but so much of what Tom has said is so important about aligning with what your real needs are. So the City Council in Turner this year approved spending money out of our general fund to provide regulatory review separate from what's coming at us to help people who don't have the money. So we put $10,000 into a pot to say when the Tap House wants to redevelop the church downtown, and he's someone who was a graduate of Cascade High School, right? We went ahead and did the fire code review to make sure they get the right answers before they go to the building officials who will give them the wrong answers because they're only quoting from a code book. So it's a small amount of money, takes a little bit of political will, and we'll have a tap house and a restaurant being built downtown this year for a small amount of investment.
Mine is more of a comment also, and I think this is true with a lot of small cities, is that when you get into, we just recently, probably in the last 5 years, have really started focusing on economic development and identifying our properties and what's available and what's not. You know, but we've had a big piece for a long time that's just been a problem, and the business would want to come and be on there, and then when they'd go up to our neighbors, Woodburn, instead, because of the problems that they were confronted with all the time. And so this is a shout out to our new commissioner, Kevin there, who, when he first came on board, was elected, came out and kind of met everybody and wanted to know what, you know, things we were faced with. And so I talked about that problem area that we have there and some of the things we were faced with. And so I think sometimes what happens is that you dive into an area and you want to build those partnerships and relationships, and then you get these layers of permits and buried permits and all of these things, and people just go away and look for something that's easier. And his attitude was, well, we just need to attack the problem ahead of time, you know. And so instead of waiting for all these people to be faced with running away, we were able to say, you're going to run into these problems, and they were able to meet the regional solutions team up front. And we've got our first big store going in there, and it'll probably be done in August, you know. So that was probably a solution I hadn't looked at realistically, was identifying the problems ahead of time, getting the people on board ahead of time that can help solve it, so people don't have to run away. So I don't know.
When I say you're managing a portfolio of assets, including those sites, you're making investments in time and leadership and maybe some money to prevent problems, so that when the investor finally shows up, their path is made easier.
Right. Thanks.
And sometimes it's just being a city staff person or elected official knowing, you may not have resources, but putting them in contact with the local bank or the lender or the agency that can provide assistance, and that will help them.
Yep, and I think helping some of those conversations with insurance agents for some of these smaller business that Becky was talking and you were talking about, say get insurance. Well, not everybody's ready to issue that kind of insurance. So those are some of the things that you can do ahead of time to make that transaction simpler.
Thank you, and give Tom a big hand. So has everybody heard something that sparked their interest? Great. So I think this is really kind of just where we wanted this day to begin, where we want it to go, and we want the energy to continue on not only here, but back into your community. So be taking notes and things that make sense to your communities. I just want to, if you've found an idea that sparks your interest, I want to draw your attention into your pamphlet or in your packet. There's this blue handout. Mary to support rural communities, and it's called our Community Project Grants. We have a deadline that is coming up. It's May 26th. Applications are simple. Support is available, and we want your ideas to be submitted. This is a grant program that we not only are making available this year, but it is also in our budget for next year. So if your application isn't funded this year by chance, keep thinking, keep resubmitting, asking for input, because we'll be having additional grant opportunities for small rural communities in the upcoming fiscal year. Your ideas matter, your communities matter, and we want to be able to be a partner with you in spurring economic development and excitement in your communities. Any questions about the grant program? If so, Sarah is over here on the side. She is the manager of that program. She works with our Economic Development Advisory Board to review those, and she can give you some tips if you're needing that. I don't see lunch in the back. It's out on the side. So lunch is going to be here. We have about 30 minutes, so go ahead and make your way to the lunch line. We'll call you back in here in about 30 minutes. Continue to eat your lunch as our next speaker begins. Just a reminder, we have evaluations that we'll be putting on your tables, and hope that you'll give us some feedback, and encourage you to visit the exhibitor hall in the back, the table back there. Thanks for being here this morning, and enjoy your lunch.